Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about a popular diet or eating structure in the health world, the DASH diet. Now DASH is actually an acronym. It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. Now, as you might have guessed, this was a diet structure that was first implemented in order to help prevent and or manage hypertension. Now, in case you didn't know, hypertension is basically a disease that is characterized by a chronic elevation in blood pressure in levels above what is considered healthy or normal. And it is actually a common mistake many people make when talking about hypertension. Hypertension isn't simply having a high blood pressure. Any healthy individual is going to experience an increase in blood pressure right after a meal. Hypertension is basically having a chronically elevated blood pressure, even at times in the day when you are fasted. An easier way to think about it is that a normal person's blood pressure is, let's say at this baseline, while a person that suffers from hypertension is going to have a baseline of about around here. Both individuals are going to experience fluctuations in their blood pressure throughout the day, but the person that suffers from hypertension is simply going to have a much higher baseline of blood pressure, which is why people that suffer from hypertension have to be very conservative with their salt intake. Now, you would probably assume that hypertension is something that is caused by just eating a lot of salt, but in actuality, hypertension is a chronic disease and we don't exactly know why it's caused. It has a lot of risk factors. Salt might be one of them, but there's a lot more factors that come into play, like obesity, lack of exercise, bad nutrition habits, etc., etc. Okay, and with that parenthesis out of the way, let's talk about the DASH diet. Now, like I said, the DASH diet was originally implemented as a means to help prevent and or manage hypertension. It was promoted by the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. And although it started as simply a means to help prevent hypertension, the DASH diet is now considered one of the healthiest eating plans or structures in the world of health and disease prevention. So naturally, I'm going to analyze it and offer my own personal and professional opinion on it. Now, I use the term diet, but DASH isn't actually a diet, as in a meal plan. It actually gives the user food intake goals in terms of servings, so those may be daily or weekly, and it also gives the user macronutrient and micronutrient goals. Now, keep in mind that these servings are for a typical 2,000 calorie diet, so you'll need to adjust accordingly in order to meet your individual needs. Okay, so first of all, the DASH diet recommends 6 to 8 servings of grains per day. Now, a serving of grain can be a slice of bread, about half a cup of cooked rice or barley, and generally any starchy source that amounts to about 100 calories. Next, the DASH diet recommends up to 6 servings of meat, poultry and or fish per day. And a serving of those is around 30 grams or about an ounce. Now, something that's not mentioned here is whether or not eggs are actually considered a part of meat. Now, the DASH diet is very restrictive in dietary cholesterol intake, so I would assume that eggs would be encouraged to be consumed more sparingly. The DASH diet recommends 4 to 5 servings of vegetables per day. Now, a serving of vegetables is about 1 cup of raw leafy vegetables or half a cup of any other vegetables, whether it be frozen or fresh. Now, a detail concerning fruits and vegetables. In the general nutrition and health world, it's debated whether or not some food sources like starchy vegetables, legumes, and vegetable and fruit juices count as a serving of fruits or vegetables. It's generally agreed upon that those food sources will only count as 1 serving of fruits and vegetables, regardless of how much quantity you actually consume. So for example, if you drank 1 cup of, let's say, carrot juice, then it would only count as 1 serving of vegetables. If you drank 2 cups of carrot juice, then it would still only count as 1 serving of vegetables. Now, the reason for this is because those options provide similar nutrients and general benefits to fruits and vegetables, but not exactly. So for example, a fruit juice provides the same antioxidants and plant compounds that are found in fruits and vegetables, but doesn't provide the same amount of fiber. The DASH diet also recommends 4 to 5 servings of fruits. Now, a serving of fruit is one medium-sized fresh fruit, or around 150 grams, or a fourth of a cup of dried fruits, and also a cup of fruit juice, which, as we just mentioned, will only count as one serving regardless of how much you drink. The DASH diet recommends 2 to 3 servings of low-fat dairy. Now, a serving of dairy can be a glass of milk, 1 cup of yogurt, or a slice or around 20 to 30 grams of cheese. The DASH diet also recommends 2 to 3 servings of fats and oils. Now, while it doesn't specify which plants and oils you can choose, you will probably want to lean towards the healthy plant oils like olive oil. And the serving is typically 1 tablespoon, or around 15 grams. Now, those were the daily recommended intakes. Now, as for the weekly recommended intakes, the DASH diet recommends that you consume 4 to 5 servings of beans, dry seeds, nuts, and peas per week. And this is a little bit confusing to me, since I view all of those options as being exceptionally healthy, and I personally would definitely encourage people to consume much more of them. Now, the DASH diet does tend to limit fat intake a little bit more than a typical diet, which you'll see in the macronutrient section of this video. Now, that said, that still doesn't explain why you would want to limit beans and peas to 4 to 5 times per week, since beans and generally legumes contain very little amounts of fat. And even if the excuse was to limit fat intake, then why wouldn't you just limit the plant oils or even the meats or dairy? Is it because they're pretty high in calories? Maybe, who knows? In any case, that's what the DASH diet recommends. And it also recommends consuming 5 or less servings of sweets per week, which absolutely makes sense. And while it doesn't specify, I would assume that the 5 or less servings basically encompasses a whole range of, junk food like sweets, processed food, things like pizza, and, generally all of the junk food that you would typically assume. So those were the food portions. Now let's take a look at the macronutrient split and as well as the recommended micronutrient intakes. Now, the DASH diet recommends limiting fat intake to 27% of total daily calories. In addition, the DASH diet recommends limiting saturated fat intake into no more than 6% of the total daily calories. And as far as saturated fats, you can see that this is pretty restrictive. I mean, it's typically encouraged to keep saturated fats at no more than 10% of your total daily calories, while the DASH diet recommends you keep it under 6%, which is pretty restrictive. I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying it's pretty restrictive. The DASH diet recommends keeping protein intake to about 18% of your total daily calories and carbohydrates to about 55% of your total daily calories. And I didn't find any specifications about simple carbohydrates like sugars, although I would assume that it would be typically encouraged to follow the general regulations, which say limiting sugar to about 10% of your total daily calories. The DASH diet also recommends an intake of 30 grams or more of dietary fiber and also limiting dietary cholesterol, which actually, yes, is considered to be a macronutrient, to no more than 150 milligrams per day. Now, 150 milligrams of cholesterol really isn't that much, considering that about a medium-sized egg of around 50 grams contains around 200 grams of dietary cholesterol. Now, I'll offer my own opinion on whether or not I agree with that later in the video. But for now, you can see that the DASH diet generally recommends a diet that is lower in fats and saturated fats, medium intake of protein. I mean, the DASH diet isn't meant as a pre-bodybuilding prep diet, a pretty high consumption of carbohydrates, a pretty high consumption of dietary fiber, and a low consumption of dietary cholesterol as far as macronutrients go. Now, for the micronutrients, the DASH diet obviously recommends limiting sodium. The DASH diet states to keep sodium under 2300 milligrams per day, but even recommends going as down as 1500 milligrams per day for better results. Now, 2300 milligrams of sodium equate to about 6 grams of salt. 1500 milligrams of sodium equate to about 3.75 grams of salt. Now, just for reference, one slice of bread contains around 400 milligrams of sodium. So you'll need to be pretty restrictive on yourself if you want to adhere to that 1500 milligram goal. And as a fun fact, the biggest amount of sodium that we actually consume isn't from the salt that we ourselves put in our foods. It's from a lot of food options that are already processed and already contain a very high amount of sodium. Options like bread, cheese, and deli meats. The DASH diet also recommends a potassium intake of 4,700 milligrams per day. You will need to consume lots of fruits, potatoes, legumes, and generally potassium-rich foods, which isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that the potassium intake is pretty high. And this shouldn't come as a surprise since the DASH diet was originally developed as a means to control hypertension. And potassium is actually a very important component when it comes to regulating blood pressure. The DASH diet recommends a daily intake of 1,250 milligrams of calcium, which if you stick to those 2 to 3 servings of low-fat dairy per day, you shouldn't have trouble reaching. The DASH diet also recommends a daily intake of 500 milligrams of magnesium. And this is another one that's a bit on the high side. At least with potassium, lots of foods actually contain potassium, from things like potatoes all the way to seafoods. But with magnesium, very little foods actually contain a lot of magnesium. Now, some of the best magnesium containing foods include whole grain bread, dark chocolate, seeds, and leafy vegetables. So your diet will have to contain those foods if you want to hit those 500 milligrams of magnesium. Again, I'm not saying this as a bad thing. I'm not trying to discredit the DASH diet. I'm just saying that your diet is gonna have to be very balanced and regulated in order to meet those strict daily intake goals, which I think is exactly the point of the DASH diet. Now, lastly, the DASH diet plan recommends at least 300 minutes of low intensity exercise or 150 minutes of medium or high intensity exercise, or a combination of the two per week. Now, low intensity exercise can be something like brisk walking, hiking, swimming at a low pace. Generally, low intensity cardio, while moderate to high intensity exercise could be anything from weightlifting, sprinting, martial arts, etc., etc. Now, all in all, the DASH diet tends to recommend a slightly higher carbohydrate intake instead of a slightly higher fat intake, which is reflected in both the recommended macronutrient intakes as well as the recommended daily and weekly food servings. The DASH diet also recommends keeping sodium, dietary cholesterol, and saturated fats to a minimum. So now I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of the DASH diet. Now keep in mind that those pros and cons will be based on my own personal and professional opinion. Now that said, I'm not just getting the opinion of thin air. My opinion is obviously based on scientific research and from experience, but that said, a professional opinion is still an opinion, and so take this with a little grain of salt. Get it? Salt? Because it's a diet to prevent. Now, as for the pros, the DASH diet recommends a high intake of whole grain carbohydrates, fruits, and vegetables. Now, by extension, this means that the DASH diet promotes a diet that is high on complex carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, fiber, and antioxidants. The DASH diet is generally well balanced, promoting a decent calcium, potassium, and B12 intake from the 2 to 3 servings of low-fat dairies per day, promoting a good protein intake from the up to 6 servings of meats, poultry, and fish per day, as well as vitamins B12, niacin, and generally vitamins found in meats, as well as a decent intake of omega-3s in the case of fish. The DASH diet limits the intake of saturated fats and sodium, which means that it promotes the general well-being of the heart, since both saturated fats and sodium have been linked to an increased risk of heart diseases. The DASH diet also limits simple sugars. Now, it doesn't outright say that you should be consuming less sugar, but this is reflected on the recommended food servings, which state that you should be limiting sweets to no more than 5 servings per week. The DASH diet encourages you to consume a high amount of potassium and magnesium, both of which have many health benefits that I won't expand upon here, but you can certainly easily find them if you search them up. The DASH plan also recommends getting a decent amount of exercise, which again, I won't expand upon why this is important. You can very easily find it if you want to search for it. I would say that the DASH diet is generally health promoting and specifically protects against the risk of cardiovascular diseases as well as high blood pressure. Now, as far as some of the cons of the DASH diet, some of its principles seem to be a bit outdated. For example, being overly restrictive on dietary cholesterol, which many recent studies have proved that dietary cholesterol isn't as strongly associated with an increase in blood cholesterol, something that I'm sure a lot of you already know. And in my personal opinion, in generally healthy individuals, dietary cholesterol shouldn't be feared that much. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that you should be going crazy, eating 20 eggs per day. I'm just saying that 150 milligrams is a pretty high restriction for an otherwise healthy individual. The DASH diet limits, or at least doesn't promote as much, certain foods that are generally accepted to be very healthy and very beneficial to health. Foods like nuts, seeds, and legumes. For example, I personally would definitely encourage you to consume nuts, seeds, and legumes every day if you could. Its recommended protein intake will likely be inefficient in people that regularly engage in resistance training or strength training, or are generally trying to meet an athletic goal. Now, like I mentioned previously, the DASH diet isn't actually meant as a bodybuilding prep diet, so I guess that makes sense. And last but not least, this wouldn't be a scientific video without some actual scientific evidence. So let's take a look at those. So the first article is a meta-analysis that studied the relationship between the DASH diet and the risk of stroke. The conductors of the study analyzed 12 different cohort studies, which encompassed a total of 548,632 participants. Now, all 12 studies analyzed the adherence of the participants to the DASH diet using an FFQ, or Food Frequency Questionnaire. 11 of those 12 studies were finally examined for the direct relationship between the DASH diet and the likelihood of a stroke. And all 11 studies unanimously agreed that adhering to the DASH diet was indeed linked to a decreased risk of a stroke. The second study was a prospective cohort study, which studied the DASH diet's relationship with renal function decline, as well as the DASH diet's relationship with all-cause mortality. 632 stable renal transplant recipients were included. And again, the information about their diets was taken using an FFQ. The median follow-up for the study was 5.3 years. The participants in the highest tertile, which basically means the participants that were adhering to the DASH diet's principles the most, had the least risk of total renal failure as well as all-cause mortality. The last study was a prospective cohort study that examined whether or not the DASH diet provides any protective effects against cardiovascular diseases. The study examined a total of 23,655 adults located in the UK. Again, the dietary habits were examined using an FFQ. A higher adherence to the DASH diet's principles was linked to a lower risk of stroke, lower incidence as well as mortality from cardiovascular diseases, as well as a lower risk of all-cause mortality. So, is the DASH diet healthy and effective? It absolutely is. And its effectiveness is also backed up by studies, as you can clearly see. And I would personally recommend to people following the DASH diet's principles, with some minor exceptions. Personally, I wouldn't limit nuts, seeds, and legumes to a few times per week. I would definitely encourage people to consume them more frequently if they can. I would also personally keep my carbohydrates a bit lower, maybe around 45 to 50%, and increase my fat intake a little bit, maybe to around 30 to 35%. Now, me personally, I also consume a higher intake of protein, but that's because I exercise with weights regularly, and so it makes sense for me to consume a higher protein intake. I also wouldn't bother restricting my dietary cholesterol as strictly as the DASH diet recommends. But again, I am a completely healthy individual. If you are suffering from cardiovascular diseases or have an increased risk of cardiovascular diseases, then it's definitely a good idea to stick to the side of caution when it comes to dietary cholesterol. Now, apart from those exceptions, I would say that the DASH diet is generally a very healthy and very effective style of eating, and I would definitely recommend it to most people. In any case, hope you enjoyed the video and learned something. If you did, then ratings are very appreciated, and also feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content just like this. Thank you for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.